I know the topic of our conversation today is AI. AI is both a novel example of a possible catastrophic risk through certain types of utilization. It is also an accelerant to every category of catastrophic risk potentially. So that one has a lot of attention at the moment.
So that makes AI different than the rest that you've mentioned?
Definitely.
And are you focused primarily on avoiding disaster or moving towards something that's much more heavenly or positive, like a Shangri-La?
So we have an assessment called the metacrisis. There's a more popular term out there right now, the polycrisis. We've been calling this the metacrisis since before coming across that term. Polycrisis is the idea that the global catastrophic risk that we all need to focus on and coordinate on is not just climate change, and is not just wealth inequality, and is not just kind of the breakdown of Pax Americana and the possibility of war or these species extinction issues, but it's lots of things. There's lots of different global catastrophic risks, and that they interact with each other, and they're complicated, and there can even be cascades between them, right? We don't have to have climate change produce total venusification of the Earth to produce a global catastrophic risk. It just has to increase the likelihood of extreme weather events in an area. And we've already seen that happening. Statistics on that seem quite clear. And it's not just total climate change. Deforestation affecting local transpiration and heat in an area can have an effect on, and total amount of pavement laid and whatever can have an effect on extreme weather events. But extreme weather events, I mean, we saw what happened to Australia a couple of years ago when a significant percentage of a whole continent burned in a way that we don't have near-term historical precedent for. We saw the way that droughts affected the migration that led to the whole Syrian conflict that got very close to a much larger scale conflict. The Australia situation happened to hit a low population density area, but there are plenty of high population density areas that are getting very near the temperatures that create total crop failures, whether we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Iran. And so if you have massive human migration, the UN currently predicts hundreds of millions of climate-mediated migrants in the next decade and a half, then it's pretty easy under those situations to have resource wars. And those can hit existing political fault lines and then technological amplification. And so in the past, we obviously had a lot less people, right? We only had 500 million people for the entirety of the history of the world till the Industrial Revolution. And then with the Green Revolution and nitrogen fertilizer and oil and like that, we went from 500 million people to 8 billion people overnight in historical timelines. And we went from those people mostly living on local subsistence to almost all living on dependent upon very complicated supply chains now that are 6-continent mediated supply chains. So that means that there's radically more fragility in the life support systems so that local catastrophes can turn to breakdowns of supply chains, economic effects, et cetera, that affect people very widely. So polycrisis, kind of looking at all that, metacrisis adds looking at the underlying drivers of all of them. Why do we have all of these issues? And what would it take to solve them, not just on a point-by-point basis, but to solve the underlying basis? So we can see that all of these have to do with coordination failures. We can see that underneath all of them, there are things like perverse economic interests. If the cost of the environmental pollution to clean it up was something where in the process of the corporation selling the PFAS as a surfactant for waterproofing clothes or whatever, it also had to pay for the cost to clean up its effect in the environment, or the oil cost had to clean up the effect on the environment. So you didn't have the perverse incentive to externalize costs onto nature's balance sheet, which nobody enforces. Obviously, we'd have none of those environmental issues, right? That would be a totally different situation. So can we address perverse incentive writ large? That would require fundamental changes in what we think of as economy and how we enact that, so political economy. So we think about those things. So I would say with the metacrisis assessment, we'd say that we're in a very novel position with regard to catastrophic risk, global catastrophic risk, because until World War II, there was no technology big enough to cause a global catastrophic risk as a result of dumb human choices or human failure quickly. And then with the bomb, there was. It was the beginning. And that's a moment ago in evolutionary time, right? And if we reverse back a little bit before the bomb, until the Industrial Revolution, we didn't have any technology that could have caused global catastrophic risk even cumulatively. The industrial technology, extracting stuff from nature and turning it into human stuff for a little while before turning it into pollution and trash, where we're extracting stuff from nature in ways that destroy the environment faster than nature can replenish it, and then turning it into trash and pollution faster than it can be processed, and doing exponentially more of that because it's coupled to a economy that requires exponential growth to keep up with interest. That creates an existential risk. It creates a catastrophic risk within about a few centuries of cumulative effects. And we're basically at that few century point. And so that's very new. All of our historical systems for that, our historical systems for thinking about governance in the world didn't have to deal with those effects. We could just kind of think about the world as inexhaustible. And then, of course, when we got the bomb, we're like, all right, this is the first technology that rather than racing to implement, we have to ensure that no one ever uses. In all previous technologies, there was a race to implement it. It was a very different situation. But since that time, a lot more catastrophic technologies have emerged. Catastrophic technologies in terms of applications of AI and synthetic biology and cyber and various things that are way easier to build than nukes and way harder to control. And when you have many actors that have access to many different types of catastrophic technology that can't be monitored, you don't get mutually assured destruction and those types of safeties. So we'd say that we're in a situation where the catastrophic risk landscape is novel. Nothing in history has been anything like it. And the current trajectory doesn't look awesome for making it through. What it would take to make it through actually requires change to those underlying coordination structures of humanity very deeply. So I don't see a model where we do make it through those that doesn't also become a whole lot more awesome. And that's why we say the only other example is to control for catastrophes, you can try to put very strong control provisions. Okay, so now, unlike in the past, people could, or pretty soon, have gene drives where they could build pandemic weapons in their basement, or drone weapons where they could take out infrastructure targets, or now AI weapons even easier. We can't let that happen, so we need ubiquitous surveillance to know what everybody's doing in their basement, because if we don't, then the world is unacceptably fragile. So we can see catastrophes or dystopias, right? Because most versions of ubiquitous surveillance are pretty terrible. And so if you can control decentralized action, if you don't control decentralized action, the current decentralized action is moving towards planetary boundaries and conflict and et cetera. If you control it, then what are the checks and balances on that control?
Sorry, what do you mean control decentralized actions?
So when we look at what it causes catastrophe, so when we're talking about environmental issues, there's not one group that is taking all the fish out of the ocean or causing species extinction or doing all of the pollution. There's a decentralized incentive that lots of companies share to do those things. So nobody's intentionally trying to remove all the fish from the ocean. They're trying to meet an economic incentive that they have that's associated with fishing. But the cumulative effect of that is overfishing the ocean, right? So if there's a decentralized set of activity where the lack of coordination of everybody doing that, everybody pursuing their own near-term optimum creates a shitty term global minimum for everybody, right? A long-term bad outcome for everybody. If you try to create some centralized control against that, that's a lot of centralized power. And where are the checks and balances on that power? Otherwise, how do you create decentralized coordination? And similarly, if you're looking at things like in an age where terrorism can get exponential technologies, and you don't want exponentially empowered terrorism with catastrophe weapons for everyone, to be able to see what's being developed ahead of time, does that look like a degree of surveillance that nobody wants? To be able to control those things not happening, right? That's what I mean. So how to prevent the catastrophes, if the catastrophes are currently the result of the human motivational landscape in a decentralized way, if the solution is a centralized method powerful enough to do it, where are the checks and balances on that power? So a future that is neither cascading catastrophes nor control dystopias is the one that we're interested in. And so, yes, I would say the whole focus is that this is now AI comes back into the topic because a lot of people see possibilities for a very protopian future with AI where it can help solve coordination issues and solve lots of resource allocation issues. It can also make lots of things, the catastrophes worse and dystopias worse. It's actually kind of unique in being able to make both of those things more powerful.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.